So recently, a lot of people are hyped up over the release of Firestone V3, but unfortunately, I'm not one of them. My name's TaraRig, you can call me Kate, and today let's talk about Firestone V3 and how the hype for it died as fast as Get Enveloped got community banned. First things first, let's talk about the major issue most people had when V3 was first brought up. The delay. I mean, this thing was announced in 2018 and it's just now being released in 2023. 5 years later. Just to give you a better grasp on this time gap, this was the time that God's Plan was #1 on the charts. Tide Pod memes were trending and no one was even thinking about the dumpster fire that was COVID. Like, I'm fully convinced that GTA 6 could have made a faster development than this game if it wanted to. But in the end, it's not really the waiting that's the issue, it's the things that happened because they kept insisting the game was nearly done. Departments were told to start updating their policies to accommodate V3 years in advance, but by the time V3 actually released, so much had changed that those policies were irrelevant. In addition to that, some departments, DHS, DOBW, were told that they would be completely abolished in V3, which, as you can imagine, killed their morale. Even DHS admits that they were on life support for the last few months of existence. On the development side of things, there's two major issues. The first of which being the tech inside the game ranges from like 2018 to 2023, which has to cause some sort of issues with a consistently designed game. Like, seeing the CV livery next to some of the cars recently made is like seeing an old Mac next to the newest PC on the market. And while I'll admit I think they pulled it off pretty well, there's gotta be some issues and disparity between the older and the newer elements of the game. But not only is the old tech itself the issue, another massive problem is that development on V2, the group's only active game, was for the most part halted to work on V3. This just doesn't make sense to me. V2's new enough to be considered new, and it was gaining a good amount of players on average, and people liked it. But eventually, without the developer support, it went stagnant, naturally. And it did lose a lot of the player base. On popular nights, I'd used to see the game maxed out at like 60 players with a line waiting to get in, but in recent months it's been sitting at 30 or less. Sometimes the server's even completely empty. And I make these comments in no way to discredit the developers. I've spoken with multiple of them on numerous occasions and they're all extremely talented and fun to be around. I just wish that the execution of V3's rollout and cutting development from V2 had received more forethought and planning from an administrative point of view. Overall, the sheer amount of time it took from the announcement to V3 to the date it was actually released was more than annoying. It was frustrating. For the community as a whole, not just me. It almost felt as if there was a marketing ploy to get us to stay in the group under the promise that this holy grail of a game would be released any day, but it never actually did. Now that I've covered the basic issue that is the horrendous delay, it's time to get into some of the more niche things that I think really killed the V3 launch, one of which being soft launching. This is basically when a company or a person releases either a restricted version of their product to an open audience, for example things like teasers, or when they release the product to a restricted amount of individuals, for example beta testers, QA testing, and Game Pass openings. Firestone did all of this. First of all, let's talk about teasers. A lot of people think that the more teasers or screenshots or insights into the development process you post, the better off you are, because it helps show people what they're waiting for. And yeah, I agree with that, to an extent. And I think Firestone definitely went past the line. Some teasers were good, but when your audience already knows everything about your game, what's the point of playing it? I don't think that the smartest way to build hype for a new game is by talking about every single step of the development process. As someone who is on their way out of the community, I was one of those people who was sort of holding on to the hope of V3, but when I saw unpolished teasers released constantly, and I already pretty much knew what the game was going to be, I lost interest pretty quickly. It wasn't worth it for me to play because I already felt like I knew everything. The launch was not as exciting. Additionally, Firestone had one of the most open Game Pass QA testing systems I've ever seen, and by that I mean if you paid your way into the game or got picked for QA testing, you got to play it. This was actually probably beneficial short-term for the group because it provided them with quick cash injections from the purchases of Game Passes, but in the end, like the teasers, it brought down the hype. People who had access to the game played it, got tired of it, and then when it actually released, they didn't care enough to get on because they've been playing for months. I mean, the game first opened to Game Passes in 2019, 4 years before the actual release date. People had 4 years to look at the empty map devoid of other players, which is automatically going to put them off to it. Those with access also often streamed the game to show their friends, which resulted in more eyes on an unfinished product and more people who realized they didn't actually care that much. This whole thing is the same reason that most photographers won't give you their raw photos. They don't want you seeing their unfinished, unpolished work because it looks like it portrays them in a negative light, which is not something you want as a brand, an individual, or a group. Another issue with the Game Pass version of V3 is that it took away from the player count of V2. Instead of having like 60 plus players on V2, a lot of the players were playing on an unreleased version of V3 that only some people could access. And those that were left in V2 often didn't have enough people for the game to function. For example, in Firestone, you need a certain number of people on the police teams in order to commit criminal actions like robbing banks, or to get any sort of response to the things that you set up, which makes the game not fun. If you can't participate in the fun mechanics of the game, why play the game? This weird half-launching of V3 that leached players slowly out of V2 is honestly what I think the worst part of this game's release was. The servers were ridiculously empty for both games, people hated it, and yet no action was taken to fix it or to close V3. This brings me to my next point. I feel like talking about money is always something touchy to get into, but at the same time I feel like it's also kind of warranted here. One of the major outrages over V3's release is that people who paid to get into V3 had to repay 25 Robux in order to access the game once it launched in its beta version. Which, by the way, I would just like to quickly point out that a community member named Straphos called this in 2019, and here we are. I just found that funny. Anyways, it's not like the game passes were cheap either. I didn't know the cost off the top of my head, so I asked in the community's general chat on Discord. Early access cost about 1,000 Robux, which is nearly $3.50. Alpha was $2.50, about 87 cents. And then, of course, to play the game now, it's 25 Robux. And I understand why they had to repay. It was a different system used for access than the Game Pass system, and it's needed to keep exploiters out, or at least make them pay the group and its developers if they do want to get in and exploit before getting banned 10 seconds later and then having to repay to get back in. It's the easiest fix to a complicated problem, and believe me, I fully support taking the most simple option. Overall though, if everyone who bought a Game Pass were to rebuy the entrance fee, I calculated it to be $255 extra going to the group. And the Game Passes to begin with made the group about $3,445. I'll put the method I used to calculate this up on the screen. Could this have been the reason that it was taking so long to fully release, and why the soft launch technique remained in place even after being criticized by multiple community members? But even if it was, I'm not criticizing it. I think that as a group this large, it's important to make decisions that are in the best interest of your development staff so that you can pay them in order to operate. And I want to give a fair disclaimer as well that all of this information was publicly accessible by looking at the badges under the games. It showed me how many people bought what, and it allowed me to calculate that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be oversharing the profits to this extent. Overall, the V3 launch was bad. Really, really, really bad. It was horrible. It was horrendous. And I genuinely think that the way that this whole launch was handled played a large hand in killing this previously thriving group's activity. The massive delay and soft launching got people fed up and tired of waiting around for a group to launch something that might never come. And when they did launch, people weren't interested. My name is TaraRig, you can call me Kate, and thank you for coming to my TED Talk.